Another tradition that the pollsters drew on was the newspaper tradition of straw polls. Straw polls could range from man-in-the-street interviews to mail-in ballots that were either sent to subscribers or that readers could clip out of the newspaper and send in. These straw polls were fundamentally marketing tools designed to increase readership with a lively feature that readers could participate in, rather than being serious attempts to predict elections. This tradition, too, lives on in today's newspaper and television websites, where polls of readers are regularly conducted, usually with a small disclosure somewhere that the results are not scientific. Along with this tradition, the magazine, The Literary Digest, began to run a series of pre-election polls. These began in the 19-teens, as the Literary Digest, then one of the largest circulation magazines in the country, began to mail pre-election polls or ballots to selected lists of readers or telephone subscribers or automobile owners in an attempt to build up responses primarily as a marketing tool, but something that they published as predictions and forecasts of election results. The ballots were often attached to subscription forms, and so certainly encouraged people to subscribe to the magazine as well as send in their ballot to be counted. But what was unusual about the Literary Digest polls was that the Digest claimed, quote, uncanny accuracy, unquote, for its results, and was given considerable attention in the political realm, while correctly predicting Republican candidates in 1924 and 28, and the Democrat in 32. These successes, much helped along by the Digest's tendency to overstate the accuracy of their own results, put the Digest poll into a position of being taken seriously in political circles and having attention paid to it. Someone who studied this a little more carefully might have some doubts. For example, in 1916, the Digest poll of labor leaders correctly predicted Woodrow Wilson as the winner. But the larger poll of all of the subscribers they mailed to did not. That poll showed Wilson losing. Likewise, in 1924, while the poll got the winner right, it also showed that Robert La Follette was coming in second, rather than the actual distant third that he really finished in. Now, close observers were well aware of these deficiencies in the Literary Digest sample. It was clearly heavy on telephone subscribers, for example, but it appears that the editors of the Digest were quite unconcerned about sampling bias. Indeed, it seems likely they didn't even have much of an idea about such sampling bias. Excuse me a moment. This is Sare Bear, the cat, who's climbing on the desk. Goodbye, Sare Bear. The 1936 election produced a major change in polling. In July of 1936, a young upstart named George Gallup published a newspaper column predicting the Literary Digest poll would incorrectly forecast Landon to win with 56% of the vote. Now, that was quite a risk coming in July before the November election, but Gallup based in his prediction on his own polling and his knowledge of the bias that existed in the Digest sample. Gallup collected part of its data using the same sources as the Digest: telephone subscribers, automobile owners, and registered voters. But Gallup also collected other data that did not suffer from the same bias towards higher socioeconomic groups that these lists otherwise overrepresented. Gallup used personal interviews taken door to door to construct a much more representative sample. In effect, this was David calling his shot against Goliath. Gallup even offered a money-back guarantee to newspapers that bought his column based on his being a better forecast of the election than the Digest. Gallup's final forecast was 54% for Roosevelt with 477 electoral votes. In fact, he won 61% and 523 electoral votes. But the Digest had it backwards, giving Landon 55%. Gallup's July diagnosis of the Digest problem was precise and, from a modern perspective, spot on in identifying some of the issues. The first was a sampling frame bias that favored middle and upper incomes. The second was a response bias, which was inevitable with mail-in questionnaires with no follow-up. And that bias also favored the same upper socioeconomic status groups, as you saw with the sampling frame based on telephone subscribers, auto owners, and so on. And finally, Gallup pointed out that in 1936 there was a new alignment of partisanship with class, social class, that made these long-standing biases, which had been part of the Digest poll for a couple of decades, made those biases far more consequential because the bias was now more correlated with the vote choice than it had been in earlier Literary Digest samples. So who was this young upstart George Gallup, and where did he come from? Gallup stood at the intersection of the academic, market research, and journalism worlds. His PhD in applied psychology from the State University of Iowa was titled An Objective Method for Determining Reader Interest in the Content of a Newspaper. Gallup actually handed respondents the previous day's newspaper and had them turn through and look at each column and identify whether they had read that column the day before. One of the findings of Gallup's research, one that has echoes today, is that it showed that readers were far more interested in the sports section and the comics than they were in the international news and the editorial page. Then as now, the so-called prestige parts of the paper were not really the parts that the average reader was most concerned with. While a graduate student, Gallup taught a course in journalism, and then after graduation with his PhD, moved to Drake University. And by 1931, he was a professor of journalism at Northwestern University in Evanston. His research continued to focus on readership studies of newspapers and magazines, that is, the very market research that industry was interested in. And his studies were well known enough to attract attention. He became a consultant for Lever Brothers, for example, in 1932. By 32, he accepted a job with an ad agency, Young and Rubicam, conducting market research full-time. But among other talents, Gallup was also a great entrepreneur, and over the next 3 years he developed what came to become the Gallup poll. His first independent column on this, America Speaks, appeared in October 1935. But it's also clear that Gallup was conducting experiments with survey research, with polling, as early as 1933, and developed much of his technique during the period 34 and 35, so that by the time he reached the 1936 election and his bold forecast, he had enough experience and enough data to have refined his techniques, to have developed some appreciation of their accuracy and perhaps of its limits. So it's important to realize that while Gallup sprung onto the national scene in 35 and 36, his research was based on some significant efforts in the previous 3 or 4 years.